Titanfall 2 is an extraordinary first-person shooter. It is a video game I personally hold in incredibly high regard, and I also wholeheartedly believe it to be one of the best examples of its genre. This video, a supercut of my work covering Titanfall 2, delves deeper into why, analysing its campaign level by level to hopefully highlight all the things which make it such an exceptional experience. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Militia Rifleman Jack Cooper is training to become a pilot, talented soldiers each linked to a giant robot known as a Titan. As the 9th Militia Fleet travels to the planet of Typhon, controlled by the sinister Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation, or IMC for short, Cooper's mentor and pilot, Captain Ty Lastimosa, continues to show him the ropes, but their training session is cut short as the militia prepare to assault the planet, which is where BT-7274 begins. Before we really get into the swing of things, I want to highlight how developer Respawn Entertainment integrates the visual of Cooper's lifeboat into Titanfall 2's title screen. It's not the first game to have done something like this, but it's nonetheless very visually striking, and Respawn honestly could have chosen the easy option of simply throwing the title up on screen. They didn't, however, and went the extra mile, and I think it's a good early indication of how much care was paid to even the little details throughout Titanfall 2's campaign. As Cooper plummets towards the ground, you catch a glimpse of his face for the first time, and judging by the panicked radio messages in the background, things aren't going too well. After a fade to black, you wake up in the thick of things with a battle between the militia and IMC forces raging ahead of you. The ruins of the 9th Militia Fleet's flagship, the MCS James McCallan, the ship you were just on, burn bright against the night sky as you join the fight, and as you push forward, Cooper is knocked over by an IMC Titan arriving on the scene, but thankfully Lastimosa intervenes in the nick of time to save him. After checking on a barely conscious Cooper, Lastimosa and BT do an admirable job of fighting off multiple enemy Titans before the pair are finally taken down by the fearsome mercenaries known as the Apex Predators, at which point Cooper promptly passes out. The next scene does a good job of further introducing a few members of the Predators and also mentions the mysterious Ark, which will soon become a very important part of Titanfall 2's story.
We have 18 hours! 18 hours until the Ark is sealed and ready for delivery. Oi, Rika! Leave the corpses alone, you sick bastard.
Not too long after, BT saves Cooper from a pack of prowlers before Lastimosa sadly passes away, but not before handing control of his Titan over to Cooper.
BT, transfer authorization to new pilot. Link Bravo Tango 7274. Cooper, take my Titan. Use my helmet and my jump kit. This is the real thing. Take care of him.
And it's at this point that the mission really begins to open up. You need to find a battery in order to get BT up and running again, and the first thing you need to do in order to get one is take on several fairly easy movement challenges while also dealing with a few more prowlers. This whole section is designed to gradually increase in difficulty, and the first few obstacles should serve little to no problem. Respawn includes solid ground underneath each jump so you can easily try them again should you struggle, and there's also plenty of ghost runners you can watch if you need a little extra hint as to where to go next. I'm not a huge fan of the ghost runners being included in the campaign by default, as I find them fairly immersion breaking, and I also believe them to be particularly unnecessary here, where the path of progression is rather obvious thanks to the numerous flat yellow walls dotted along your route, which are clear enough signposts as to where to head next. I can certainly see why they're included, but at this stage in the game I think not incorporating these hints and pushing you to figure things out for yourself would have been the better choice, as it gets you thinking about how to use the environment to your advantage at a very early stage. After clearing a couple of these easier challenges, BT-7274 then ups the difficulty by starting to remove flaws beneath areas as you traverse, but again these paths should prove relatively easy to tackle as you begin to get to grips with the game's controls. If the first few areas were designed to get you used to the very basics of movement, then this next area is set up to get you thinking about stealth. It begins with you coming across a number of IMC troops with their backs turned, so you can experience the power of a melee attack to an unaware enemy, and the combat arena which follows gives you ample opportunity to cloak, take down an enemy in a similar manner, hide, and then do the same again, thanks to the plentiful cover dotted around the environment. Titanfall 2 then begins to combine movement and combat over the next few areas. You'll need to move through them using what you learned at the start of the mission, while also putting your newfound combat skills to the test. Respawn also reintroduces safety areas here below the walls you need to run along, which is a sensible decision as it means you won't be overly punished for your mistakes during a section which asks you to do a lot more at once than anything you've previously experienced. There's also a DMR equipped with a scope to pick up, which can be used to take on enemies in the distance, a great example of how many encounters in Titanfall 2 are set up. You enter an encounter somewhat different to anything you've taken part in so far, but are given the exact tools you need to get you through it unscathed. This is Game Design 101, and you can spot it across many games if you look for it, but it's something Titanfall 2 often does particularly well, especially when it comes to the Titan loadouts you'll find later in the campaign. After finding the battery inside the wreckage of the Macallan, there's one or two jumps here where you'll most likely need to use the recently unlocked double jump before you arrive back at BT. The conversation which follows is the first between the pair, and as you might expect, it is very clinical.
Power at 2/3. Data core reinitialized. Ocular system online. Adjusting focus. Are you alright, pilot?
I think so. Wait. Did you just call me pilot?
Yes. The late Captain Lastimosa gave you the provisional rank of acting pilot. Congratulations on your promotion. You may call me BT.
BT. Got it.
Compare it to, say, this later piece of dialogue between the pair during Into the Abyss, where the two have clearly bonded, and you'll see what I mean.
Pilot, are you alright?
Barely. That was a meat grinder. You okay?
I'm undamaged. However, I do not believe this is a food processing plant.
In my luck, this place is gonna turn itself inside out.
Or upside down, considering the circumstances.
As it turns out, another battery is required, and I've never been a fan of this particular objective. While it's not anything too egregious, I personally do find the setup of go get a battery, okay now you've got one, go get another, to be a little on the lazy side. Fortunately, what isn't on the lazy side is BT-7274's next section, which features the most difficult movement sequence you'll have come across so far. Here, your skills begin to be put a little more to the test. You've taken on easy challenges with the floor below to save you, you've done a little movement and combat at the same time, and you've tried out your double jump, and here all three are required to get you to your next destination. I also want to mention the dialogue between Cooper and BT during this section.
Pilot, my mapping systems have been restored. The ambush of the 9th Militia Fleet has landed us far off course from our original destination. We are located in hostile territory. Be careful, we cannot stay here long.
You think we can survive through this, BT?
We have no other options. We will have to improvise and adapt if we wish to survive.
What I find interesting when looking at Titanfall 2, having completed it multiple times, is that BT, in my view, actually develops more as a character than Cooper does by the end of the campaign. That's not to say Cooper isn't changed by the experience at all, but it's interesting to note that BT's dialogue is definitely more cagey than Cooper's to begin with Cooper pretty much starting out as the wisecracking pilot you quickly grow to love as the game progresses. I think this was the correct decision by Respawn, as it stops Titanfall 2's dialogue from being too blunt early on in the campaign, and it also helps provide greater contrast between Cooper and BT's relationship at the start of the game and their relationship at its conclusion. Cooper's sarcasm isn't initially understood by BT, but by Titanfall 2's midpoint, you begin to see BT really grow into the pair's relationship much more. After a second opportunity to do some sniping above an IMC outpost, another clear example of Respawn gradually escalating the mission's difficulty by introducing harder examples of previous scenarios, you eventually find another battery. Heading back towards BT, you also take on one last movement challenge, a final skill check of sorts to ensure you have the fundamentals down, before fully powering up your new Titan and hearing his much quoted 3 protocols.
Protocol 1. Link to pilot. Establishing neural link. Neural link established. Rifleman Jack Cooper, you are now confirmed as acting pilot of BT-7274. Protocol 2, uphold the mission. Our orders are to resume Special Operation 217. Rendezvous with Major Anderson at the SRS. I'm detecting incoming enemy forces. Protocol 3, protect the pilot. Reinitializing critical systems.
BT-7274's earlier movement and combat challenges were built somewhat subtly into the mission itself, but the tutorial for using your new Titans certainly isn't, which I don't think is a bad thing. Granted, you're very obviously routed to the spot and presented with easy scenarios during which to use BT's abilities, but I think by only doing it here, Respawn just about gets away with it. As mentioned, it's not exactly subtle, but this is your first time using a mechanic not included in the majority of traditional first-person shooters, and so it's understandable that Respawn wants to ensure you understand exactly how to use your newfound abilities. When later Titan loadouts are introduced, you're left to your own devices to get to grips with them, but here there's a little bit more hand-holding just to ensure you're not left in a muddle, before you're then thrown into a much tougher Titan battle soon after, during the start of the next mission, Blood and Rust. Just before taking on your first IMC Titan, BT asks Cooper to trust him for the first time, words that pretty much become his catchphrase by the end of Titanfall 2.
Pilot, enemy Titanfall detected. We will have to fight our way to safety. Get ready.
You sure about this?
Yes, trust me.
On this occasion, BT isn't asking much, but it's lovely how the phrase is used multiple times throughout the game to help continually demonstrate the growing bond between the pair. And after taking down the IMC Titan in question, the mission concludes with the pair heading off to try and uphold Protocol 2, rendezvousing with Major Eli Anderson. Blood and Rust throws you into the action from its very start, with a brief radio message letting you know that the situation you're about to step into is a relatively dire one.
This is Wallbound 3-2. We're taking heavy casualties down here. Any militant forces, please assist. We've suffered heavy losses.
As I mentioned during the introduction, I've always considered Blood and Rust to be the mission which helps you adapt to playing both on foot and in a Titan, before Titanfall 2's level design becomes much more complex in the missions which follow. Blood and Rust focuses on Titan combat to begin with the on-foot action coming a little later on, and this makes a lot of sense given the previous mission finished with a sequence designed to get you used to piloting BT. What you learn during that sequence will still be fresh in your mind, and now you get to put your newfound pilot skills to the test in a more open area, fighting with and against multiple Titans. This section also feels somewhat like a training exercise for the similar but much grander encounter which takes place later on in Titanfall 2's campaign. That mission begins on a huge open beach, and again you fight with and against other Titans, but here, earlier on in the game, developer Respawn Entertainment restricts things to a much narrower space featuring clearly defined left and right paths. This ensures you don't get overwhelmed early on in the battle as you continue to get used to piloting BT, before the final part of the area reduces the amount of cover on offer once you've got a little more into the rhythm of Titan combat. After finding yourself inside a water reclamation facility, you'll soon come across the tone loadouts and this wonderful piece of dialogue.
Pilot, this Titan weapon is an advanced design and may give us a tactical advantage.
I think somebody's in love.
A human's concept of love requires admiration, attraction, devotion, and respect. Conclusion: I am 50% in love. Pilot, with the tone loadout, we can lock onto enemies and target them with tracking rockets. This will be useful in direct combat.
While BT's comment here about being in love is one of my favourite in the entirety of Titanfall 2, it's the fact he twice encourages you to use the new loadout, which is really important. Tone is the very first loadout you pick up during the campaign, and BT's lines here are included to push you towards switching loadouts right at that moment, so you're then much more comfortable switching without needing further encouragement later on. You then get to fight against two Tones while also potentially using Tone yourself, which I suppose shows you how to both use the loadout and defend against it, but there are definitely far better examples of Respawn catering Titanfall 2's design to the loadouts you pick up elsewhere in the campaign. Once the enemy Titans have been dispatched, you're then forced to leave BT behind and head deeper into the facility on foot. What follows is a series of encounters against IMC grunts, and it's here I want to quickly highlight the sheer number of times Cooper and BT are separated throughout the campaign, because it happens a lot. In all fairness, it's not actually something I have a huge issue with during Blood and Rust in particular. A clear dividing line between on-foot and Titan gameplay gives you the opportunity to adapt to both during a mission which features relatively straightforward level design, and this particular separation also has the secondary purpose of really helping drive home the idea that Cooper and BT are two separate entities, which is really important at this stage of Titanfall 2. Some players may at first think of BT as little more than a massive suit of armour, and so having him be the one who tends to suggest the next course of action during Blood and Rust helps quickly dispel that idea. This line just after opening the gate blocking BT being a prime example.
Pilot, the safety airlock has sealed you in the control room. You must find another way out. We have no choice but to split up.
Split up? Sounds risky.
Given our dire circumstances, this is a risk worth taking. Pilot, I am tracking your location. Recommend you seek an exit.
You got it, BT. You do the same.
Copy that, pilot.
Later in the campaign, Cooper and BT are very much a partnership and make decisions together, but here the unsure pilot often takes his lead from the more experienced Titan, and it works really well. Moving forwards, there's a reference to Cool Hand Luke by the mission's antagonist, Apex Predator Kane.
Listen up. This is Kane. What we have here, my IMC and militia friends, is a failure to communicate. And that's okay. That's okay. It's all good.
And soon after, you'll run into a group of militia soldiers. I really like the Spectre which bursts through the door in the next area, as it's very Terminator-esque, but honestly, I find the Spectres on the whole to be a relatively underwhelming enemy beyond that. They're simply not different enough from the regular IMC troops to be all that interesting, and I'd love to see them go through something of a redesign should we ever get another entry in the series. Rather than use them simply as a different type of foot soldier, it'd be fantastic if they were stronger and more relentless, but were used more sparingly as a result, making them feel more like the unstoppable killing machines I like to imagine robots in the future would be, like the one bursting through the door seems to be before you very easily take him down. What follows is a fairly run-of-the-mill shooting gallery which feels almost Call of Duty-like in its setup, and the fact this is about the only time I really thought of Call of Duty during the entirety of Titanfall 2's campaign is absolutely a good thing, by the way. That encounter is followed by several more run-ins with IMC troops and Spectres, and I think this is a good time to talk about Blood and Rust's pacing, which I think is very well done. Most of the mission's story unfolds on the fly during dialogue between Cooper and BT over the radio, with Kane occasionally chiming in as well, and it feels like there's a constant drumbeat in terms of how the action unfolds. Missions like Effect and Cause or The Beacon can afford to slow down to build atmosphere as it works within the context of each, but Blood and Rust is far more straightforward and doesn't feature any extended breaks in gameplay, which means it continues to be engaging throughout, even while lacking some of the spectacle of later missions. What also helps with this is that it includes a good mix of combat and movement challenges. Combat does without doubt take up more of the mission's runtime, but what Respawn does throughout the level is perfectly timed when a movement section is included to ensure events never become too samey. For example, after meeting the militia inside the facility, you move fairly quickly between a combat encounter, a very brief movement section, a combat encounter, and finally a longer movement section. This pacing helps keep Blood and Rust interesting and also demonstrates Respawn's incredible understanding of the fundamentals. They're not only able to create the flashier levels seen later in the campaign, but also missions which are less complex in their execution, but remain engaging nonetheless. During a brief lull in proceedings, BT issues Cooper with a warning about what may be coming next.
Scans indicate multiple IMC security forces. Prepare yourself, pilot.
Before the pair finally find themselves face to face again, albeit divided by a window, and the encounter which follows is by far the best in the entire mission. You are essentially trapped and have to survive as wave after wave of enemies arrive on the scene. The area itself is an absolute beauty in that it features a staggering amount of movement options packed into one relatively small space. The long corridor straight ahead of you when you first enter the area, and the building nearby seem like the most obvious places to fight them from at first, but as you begin to explore, you'll realise everything has been designed in such a way that it's incredibly easy to move around above ground as well. And this is very important given what this encounter is designed to achieve. Throughout the rest of Blood and Rust, combat and movement have been kept mostly separate, but here you're expected to use both at the same time to get you used to moving and shooting before the two become far more interwoven during the next mission, Into the Abyss. The level design encourages that with its multitude of walls and platforms, which are used to create pathways of sorts around the area, and Respawn even goes one step further further by using the enemies you encounter to do similar as well. After clearing the first group of IMC troops and shutting down the toxic sludge flow, you'll encounter ticks for the first time. They are a very different type of enemy from anything you're used to, and this is absolutely the perfect time for them to be introduced. You don't have to worry about being shot by IMC troops or deal with any other hazards. You simply have to keep moving and stay away from them, while also taking out one or two whenever you can to create some space. They really are a brilliant enemy in that they force you to use Titanfall 2's movement mechanics to their fullest, and I can't think of too many enemies in other games who fill a similar role quite as well as the ticks do here. Of course, you don't end up just fighting ticks on their own either, and you'll soon have to deal with both them and IMC troops as well. It's a ramp up in difficulty, which some may have found quite harsh, but I think everything leading up to this point puts you in a pretty good place to be able to deal with things, should you put into practice the skills you've been honing during the rest of the mission. Once the area has finally been cleared, you're reunited with BT, and then it's finally time to face off against Kane in a boss encounter which is okay. Kane isn't too difficult to take down when playing on anything other than Master, and I also really dislike that another enemy Titan is involved at the same time. It doesn't really add anything, and honestly, I'd prefer if he was removed entirely and Kane had a little more firepower or could take more damage instead. His Titan is very similar to Scorch, which you'll be able to use in the next mission yourself, which is a nice preview I suppose, but beyond that I don't think there's really anything to write home about during this particular encounter. After dispatching Kane, you take his radio, listen to the Apex Predators communicate for a while, and BT lets you know that you have gained a tactical advantage.
The ability to decrypt enemy communications has a strong history in warfare. This will work to our advantage.
Before Blood and Rust comes to an end. I think in terms of dialogue, Into the Abyss may well be my favourite mission in all of Titanfall 2, and there's a couple of examples of why it's so great right at the beginning of the level that it's very easy to miss. First, if you decide to jump into the water.
Jump in, BT. The water's fine.
Recreational activities are non-essential to the mission.
And also this next line.
Watch your step.
Which it's worth noting also changes depending on whether you're in BT or not.
Watch our step.
These are small touches by themselves, but Titanfall 2 is a game littered with small touches like these, and honestly I think they're a huge part of the game's charm. There's not much else to see during these opening moments, but it isn't long before you come across the Scorch loadout, which I'll come back to very shortly. This discovery is followed by another piece of dialogue, this time between Blisk and Ash, courtesy of the radio taken from Kane at the end of the previous mission, Blood and Rust. I said that Into the Abyss is my favourite level in terms of dialogue, and the radio messages you can eavesdrop on are one of the biggest reasons why. Ash is also perhaps the most entertaining of the Apex Predators, something developer Respawn Entertainment may themselves agree with, given she's become a fairly big part of Apex Legends lore, and the relationship between Cooper and BT is still new enough at this point in the campaign that their communication is not quite as friendly as it will be in a few missions' time, which I think makes it particularly entertaining to listen to. Moving deeper into the facility, you'll no doubt spot quite a significant amount of Reapers, an early warning sign that they might just make an appearance later on, as well as pairs of trees being taken somewhere. Both definitely give you something to think about, but not for too long, as you're soon thrown into the mission's first combat encounter. Earlier you picked up the Scorch loadout, and the first few areas featuring combat do feel like they were designed with the loadout in mind. The long stretches ahead of you are perfect for using Firewall, which launches, you guessed it, a wall of fire in enemies' directions, and there's plenty of nooks and crannies which are perfect for grenade fire or incendiary traps. Scorch is a loadout which is most dangerous at short ranges and in tight spaces, and Respawn wants you to understand that, with Into the Abyss's opening arenas designed around its strengths. I mean, just look at this corridor and tell me it's not been designed with Scorch in mind. However, I also think this next area is an absolutely terrible one for using Scorch in. It's vast, it's open, and you now have to deal with IMC Titans as well as infantry. If those first few areas were designed to show you how effective Scorch can be in the right circumstances, then I like to think this one is laid out the way it is to show you how ineffective it can be in the wrong circumstances. I've no definitive proof that this was what Respawn was thinking, but I feel like the sudden shift from narrow corridors to a wider area is a good enough indication that they at least may have been. After taking down what feels like an army of IMC troops, BT is suitably impressed.
Enemy Titan down. Good work, pilot. Your skills are greatly improving.
He also refers to you as Pilot, which he does again a few moments later.
Pilot, this loading dock's cargo lift offers a shortcut through the facility. Check your HUD for the control panel.
This will become relevant again in just a second, but first you have to quickly visit a control room in order to raise a cargo lift. By the time you get back to BT, he has been captured, and as he's been taken away, he says this.
Pilot, I cannot free myself. Cooper.
Now, I could be wrong, but I believe this is the first time in the entire campaign that BT calls you Cooper. What I love about this is that it's one of the best examples of how well Respawn managed to balance BT being a robot, with him also being a character with emotions of his own who you can actually relate to. As he's carried away, he appeals to you not by your role, but by your name, frantically appealing to your human side, something he begins to do more often from this point onwards. By the time the campaign reaches its second half, Cooper and BT's relationship will be far stronger than it is here, but I think the very first signs of a relationship beginning to form are during Into the Abyss. Arriving at the World Foundry itself, the first thing you'll no doubt notice is the frankly absurd scale of the place. As I mentioned during the introduction, Into the Abyss was when it started to become clear to me just how brilliant Titanfall 2's campaign really is, and exploring the Foundry was a huge part of that. Straight away, you can tell it's an environment which has clearly had a lot of love put into it, and the dedication to creating such a well-realised space which will only actually be used for 10 to 15 minutes or so is very impressive. And this extends to how the level is designed as well. What I love about Titanfall 2 is how fluid its movement mechanics are, to the point where I think you could remove the enemies from a lot of scenarios and I'd still have a great time playing it like a first-person platformer. And it seems as if Respawn may have recognised that too, as Into the Abyss's level design does at its core feel a little like what you'd find in a platformer. Other levels in Titanfall 2 feel like slightly more realistic locations which have also been designed to emphasise movement, whereas the Foundry is full of floating platforms and shifting scenery, very much like the levels you'd navigate in a traditional Mario or Sonic title. There are still plenty of enemies for you to fight, but they're nothing you haven't seen before, and I don't consider them to be much more than window dressing. Sure, they help keep those who prefer the more action-packed parts of the game engaged, but the real star of the show here is the movement mechanic. If Blood and Rust's finale was a major hint that the mechanic is as fundamentally important to the Titanfall 2 experience as combat is, then Into the Abyss is very much the proof. Being good at combat and having a very basic understanding of the game's movement was enough to get you by up until this point, but from here on out, you really need to be fairly good at both in order to get by. I know it's not the most analytical way of describing things, but to put it simply, this section is just incredibly fun. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it's one of the most entertaining sections in the entirety of Titanfall 2. You spend a good 10 minutes or so jumping from platform to platform and weaving between cover, with very little in the way of interruptions other than the occasional momentary pause while moving between firefights. And all this takes place in an environment with far more options than anything you've experienced up until this point. Previous missions were relatively narrow affairs, and it was usually very obvious where you were meant to go next, whereas the Foundry is an enormous playground. You learn the basics in more controlled environments during earlier missions, and Respawn then gives you a lot more freedom to figure out the best path of progression by yourself. It's one of the longest uninterrupted gameplay sections during Titanfall 2's campaign, and perhaps also its most open. Combat and movement are so intertwined that there's very little opportunity to focus on just one or the other, and every time you think you've reached the end of the gauntlet, a new set of platforms and a new platoon of enemies appears to dial the action back up to 11 once again. It's incredibly intense and incredibly entertaining in equal measure. Eventually, however, it does come to an end, although thankfully proceedings don't slow down for long at all. But before we move on, I again just want to quickly highlight the dialogue between Cooper and BT.
Pilot, are you alright?
Barely. That was a meat grinder. You okay?
I'm undamaged. However, I do not believe this is a food processing plant.
My luck, this place is gonna turn itself inside out.
Or upside down, considering the circumstances.
It's another short but wonderfully written exchange, which again demonstrates that the pair are becoming closer. You'll soon notice the structures turned on their side as you approach them, and if you're anything like me, you were desperate to climb them, which you get to do just seconds later. Again, this only serves to highlight Titanfall 2's platforming credentials, and I think the very brief moment when you run along a wall with everything turned on its side is one of the most memorable parts of the entire campaign. And if I'm being totally honest, this section is so much fun, I would have liked it to have lasted just a minute or two longer than it does. Reaching the simulation dome, a prefabricated arena is created around you as Ash continues to taunt Cooper.
Now, We shall see how impressive you truly are.
And it's here I want to talk briefly about how hilariously evil a villain Into the Abyss makes the IMC out to be. I don't mean hilariously in a bad way either. Titanfall 2 is a fairly stylised game, and the IMC are a fairly stylised enemy. No, I use the word hilariously because I always find it funny how outrageously terrible they actually are. Think about it, they've built an absolutely enormous factory with the sole purpose of creating vast numbers of homes and other buildings, not to help people, but to blow up during combat tests. And as if that wasn't enough, they also have no qualms about using prisoners of war as part of those tests when the opportunity arises. The conflict between the militia and the IMC could have maybe been seen prior to this mission as primarily a difference in ideologies, but fighting off waves of spectres, reapers, and eventually human troops, it becomes apparent, if it hadn't already, that they are straight up evil, which is also emphasised soon after when Ash announces that the entire facility will be destroyed.
To all IMC personnel, this is Ash. I am sorry to report due to your inability to contain the security breach. I have been forced to scuttle the entire complex. Some of you may consider this overkill. It is. I suggest you back immediately.
This is followed by another short but sweet platforming sequence which I'm a huge fan of, and an encounter with some ticks. I'll talk about the ticks a little more when I cover the mission Blood and Rust separately, but a quick note here, I really dislike their use as an enemy in scenarios like this. They are great in certain encounters, like the end of Blood and Rust, as their design is actually rather clever in that they encourage you to keep moving around, but here, where there's no real movement options on offer, I don't feel like their inclusion is a necessary one. Reunited with BT, the next few areas are fairly run-of-the-mill encounters, although I do like how you move between another dome and the area behind it as the facility begins to fall apart, and the area where you fight Ash is equally impressive as you brawl between crumbling structures with explosions lighting up the background. Ash is a fairly entertaining boss battle thanks to her Ronin loadout, and I'm really glad this isn't the last we saw of her. Like most of the Apex Predators, she is something of a cartoon baddie, but for my money she may be the most entertaining of them all, although you could make a strong case for Viper as well. Ash seemingly cares less about helping the IMC and more about having her fun with Cooper and BT, and I think this makes her a little less one-dimensional than some of the other Predators. Once Ash has been dispatched, until her reappearance in Apex Legends at least, there's one final tongue-in-cheek line from BT.
Pilot, I have concluded we should take no further shortcuts.
And Into the Abyss reaches its conclusion. As the mission begins and its title appears on screen, a quick note on the name. It's an obvious play on the phrase cause and effect, and with very good reason. I'm not going to talk about it anymore for now, but I will say that it's a conceit worth keeping in the back of your mind as we progress a little further into the level. I love a scary warning sign, and Respawn ensures it's impossible to miss theirs by using fire to illuminate a portion of it and draw your attention to what it says. Much like this first corpse, covered in moss and seemingly very old, suggesting the location has been abandoned for some time, is placed slap bang in the middle of the path leading to the next area, leaving almost zero possibility that you'll move forward without noticing it. A little time spent exploring without much happening following these two clues would in my view have really helped build tension, but effect and cause continues at a brisk pace, with the environment in the next area almost immediately shifting to become a much tidier place. And so begins the gradual expansion of an entirely new mechanic used during this mission and this mission only, the ability to time travel. This flashback and the second which follows swiftly after make a few things clear. In the past, this facility was a bustling place, and somehow you were able to witness that, although for now at least, you can't control when these shifts will occur, and you have no idea if you can actually influence past events. You're then also able to radio BT to find out more about what's happening, an option which is offered up fairly frequently. These interactions have an obvious objective, to continue building Cooper's and by extension your relationship with BT, but BT is also used really well during this mission for a slightly less obvious reason. During trips to the past, it's far easier to provide exposition than in the present. Important events occur as you progress, and there are plenty of human characters on hand to help frame events. But in the future, everything has already happened and there are few signs of intelligent life, and so using BT to keep the narrative pace high even when in the present is a fantastic idea. If the past shows you what happens through events which unfold, then the present uses BT, as well as audio diaries, which I'll touch on again in just a tick, to tell you what happened, which helps ensure the more vibrant past never becomes too dominant in narrative terms. There's a really nice touch in the next area, which I'm sure many will have missed during their first playthrough. Once the environment shifts again in the theatre, and if you're speedy, it's possible to make it all the way to the stage before the area reverts back to its usual state, at which point General Marder will acknowledge your presence.
Forces. Yes, pilot, may I help you?
Which will then also be reflected in the audio log left on the stage in the present.
By decisively neutralizing the militia forces, Yes, pilot, may I help you?
If you're inquisitive, you'll give an early confirmation that what you do in the past will affect the present, and if you're not, you'll just have to wait a little bit longer. Except, as much as I love the way everything unfolds during these opening moments, and indeed the rest of the mission, I do want to quickly point out a small tweak I think could have been made. As you may have already noticed, Titanfall 2 stops you from using weapons during these opening few shifts. I understand why. In a game where the primary method of interacting with the world is through shooting things, it gets rid of the temptation to shoot things, which I'm sure made developing these earlier stages much easier for Respawn, as they were able to focus on building tension during these opening scenes without having to worry about players potentially shooting everything in sight. There is also some logic for this built into effect and cause, in that the first time you're able to use your weapon in the past is when security robots appear and Cooper is actively in danger, but he already has his gun out before they enter the scene, which doesn't make sense if we're adhering to the logic laid out at the start of the mission. Adding an animation of him pulling out his gun and some dialogue along the lines of "no point staying quiet now" would in my view have really helped tie everything together, providing a much clearer and more obvious reason for why player choice in the past had been restricted prior to this moment. After a couple more shifts, including this one which is frankly beautiful in terms of framing, Effect and Cause briefly opens up, although there's not a whole lot to discover beyond a couple of collectibles and more notably the mission's first audio log. Audio logs only appear in the present and only in this mission, and I'd guess they may have been included to further remedy the issue of the past being more story intensive than the present. But I'm not sure they're really necessary. Sure, the story of Dr. Jefferson Boyle's plight as the last man left in the facility after whatever catastrophic event occurred is a relatively interesting one. However, it's not that interesting, and so I'm not sure breaking Titanfall 2's established storytelling conventions to include them was really required, especially since they stand in direct comparison to the other ways the game's backstory unfolds throughout the mission, which I'd argue are far more engaging. Speaking of story, there's a nice line from BT at the start of this area which alludes to the fact he will eventually also have a presence in the past.
Strange. I'm picking up traces of my own data signature within this area. The distortions must be affecting my scans.
And the bodies of IMC troops, robots and Titans litter the area, although their significance won't become clearer until much later on. Moving into the reception area, a short battle with a single prowler follows before Major Anderson's grisly fate is revealed, with the top half of his body stuck in the ceiling. Analysing the data in his helmet reveals that whatever happened to the facility somehow occurred only 2 weeks prior to the Frontier Militia arriving on Typhon, with Anderson sent in to investigate.
2 weeks ago, we intercepted IMC comms. They found something on Typhon. A massive blast of energy was discharged at this location, creating time distortions. I want SRS on the ground to infiltrate the facility.
Roger that.
Which doesn't at all make sense considering how rundown the facility is and how much the corpses littering the area have decayed. Cooper's next objective is to find the wrist-mounted device mentioned in Anderson's log, and there's a nice interaction with BT here which opens a new path and introduces the idea of Cooper being thrown to his destinations in the future.
Nice. Maybe next time you can throw me.
Noted.
Something which definitely comes up again once or twice.
My scans detect a functioning uplink targeting module, 428 meters northeast. My analysis indicates a throw is our only option here. I can throw you across the gap.
As discussed previously, the next shift is the first to make it truly obvious that you're far more than simply a bystander in the past, and it's also where Titanfall uses these shifts to begin subtly teaching you a few things you'll need to remember, and without the use of long drawn-out tutorial messages that so many other games take advantage of. This guard notices Cooper and unleashes a horde of robots which can briefly be shot at before the environment shifts back to the present, which teaches you that your presence in the past will be noticed, will have an effect, and that you are able to have a direct involvement in events which unfold. Shifting back to the present, these robots must still be dispatched, and this encounter is fine. It feels a little like Resident Evil in the way a horde of enemies lumbers, or indeed crawls towards you through the darkness, but there's so many of them to destroy that it does begin to somewhat outstay its welcome by the time it concludes. However, a number of excellent additions follow. This radio message during the next shift demonstrates just how confused everyone in the facility quickly became by your presence, which helps really tie together both past and present.
Security services. Intruder may have advanced cloaking package.
Copy that. Laser measures are online. Sending a team to investigate.
And you may also catch a brief glimpse of a pair of doorways blocked by lasers, doorways which are no longer blocked in the present. At this point, you'll most likely connect the dots and learn your next lesson, realising that paths blocked by lasers in the past may not be in the present, but this is also taught again in a more obvious manner later on for those who may not have noticed. This audio log on the floor nearby in the present also alludes to a battle against 2 squads at an elevator bank.
Dr. Alexander Darren, log 14.6. The intruder has some kind of advanced tech and is slaughtering our response teams. Tyler and Wildlife Research said 2 teams were taken out of the elevator banks in a matter of seconds. By one guy.
While I'm not sold on the rest of the audio logs, I do love this one, as it refers to a battle which you won't even take part in until you've progressed a little further into the level. I'm sure plenty will have forgotten this warning by the time they make their way down the stairs towards the elevators, but it also makes for a great aha moment for those paying attention as they realise they already have an idea of what's about to happen. The next room is a narrow one, with a singular door on the other side of it the focus, which draws your attention towards it and makes sure that you're unlikely to miss its opening during the next shift. And if you're quick to shoot one or both of the guards, their bodies will appear exactly where they died in the present. This is something that happens throughout Effect and Cause, and really helps further the feeling that even smaller actions in the past have consequences in the present. The time shifts continue to increase in frequency as Cooper nears the other half of Major Anderson's body, with a loading screen signifying the end of what I would call the mission's opening phase. Given Effect and Cause's technical complexity, I don't mind that there's a loading screen here, but I'm not sold on the image used. You're just about to discover the bottom half of Major Anderson anyway, and while most will have seen it coming, I think the image does take away from the impact of the reveal immediately after. The discovery will have been expected, but nonetheless, I'm not convinced teasing it mere seconds before it's revealed was needed at all. Cooper then takes the wrist-mounted device, a quick shift demonstrates exactly what it has the power to do, and then the wonderful button prompt, press LB, or whatever button you're using, to time travel, appears on screen. And this is where the fun really begins. Similar to how most of Effect and Cause up to this point was spent easing you into the idea of past and present essentially existing simultaneously, so to speak. From here on out, it's about easing you into the idea of using the time travel mechanic to move between them during gameplay. The first challenge directly ahead encourages you to begin thinking with time travel straight away, presenting a problem which I'd guess few struggle to solve. The floor is on fire, and the path above it is blocked by electrical wires. Get past it. Easy peasy, all you need to do is shift to the past and walk safely down the corridor. Next, BT announces that he can now contact you in both the past and the present, a nice nod to the earlier dialogue where he mentions he can detect his own data signature.
Pilot Cooper, I have transferred some of my AI functions into your helmet in order to permit communication across time shifts.
And the mission then introduces another doorway blocked by lasers. Some will have missed the previous hint during the uncontrolled shift earlier on, and so here Titanfall 2 makes sure that before you can progress, you understand that these blockages can be bypassed using the time travel mechanic. A similar challenge also awaits on the other side of the laser grid, but this time in reverse to really hammer that idea home, with a doorway blocked in the present needing to be opened in the past, with 2 soldiers waiting on the other side. You'll most likely instantly react and gun both down without thinking about using the time travel mechanic, but the next area also features something of a buffer zone between them and the next set of enemies. This is sensible design, as it means once the first 2 have been taken out, there's time for a quick breather to readjust, so you can then think about taking on the guards at the other end of the room while also taking advantage of the new mechanic. And once the enemies have been cleared, another layer is also added to exploration. Effect and Cause previously taught you that laser grids and doors could be bypassed by moving between time zones, and now that that's clear, Titanfall 2 expands on that idea by demonstrating that sometimes that won't be enough, and at times you'll also need to use the mechanic a little more creatively to move past obstacles. Effect and Cause continues to make you feel like the mission's apex predator through enemies' anxious radio transmissions.
We've initiated contact with the intruder, but his movement is erratic.
And this is swiftly followed by a rather clever piece of level design. In order to progress, you need to access a control panel to open a gate, the path to which is blocked by more lasers. So you move past the lasers in the present, shift back to the past to kill the nearby guards, and then lower the gate, at which point it's revealed that a number of turrets and enemies await at the other end of the corridor, although thankfully they can't hit you through the glass. The lasers are the clever part here, as they force you to move back to the present to exit the area, which again subtly nudges you towards the solution to the problem. I'm sure many will have figured out that getting behind the turrets in the present is key, but it's great design that the lasers are used to ensure you're already in the correct time zone as you begin to come up with a strategy. That strategy, of course, most likely being to wall run across the flaming gap in the present to get behind them in the past. There is also an added twist in the form of a single prowler to deal with in the present, along with the more robust enemy forces at the end of the corridor in the past, a small taster of the encounter which soon follows. And speaking of small tasters, even the robots which appear moments later serve a purpose. In the encounter which follows, the human enemies who appear in the past are predictable in that they all appear from places you'd expect, like the elevators, whereas the prowlers tend to come from vents and can often appear behind you, and so the robots here act as a brief reminder ahead of that encounter that enemies in the present won't always appear directly ahead of you or emerge from obvious places. Approaching the elevators, it's finally time for the first combat encounter which really pushes you to shift between timelines mid-fight in order to be most successful, and it is absolutely brilliant. And given this is the point at which the mechanic truly comes into its own, I think now is the perfect time for a quick explanation of how it actually works. Essentially, the past and present are two maps lined up precisely on top of one another, with each containing art and assets reflecting the state of that particular time zone. When you hit the button to time travel, you're instantly teleported to the exact same position on the other map, which means switching between the two is instantaneous. It works so well because it means there's no time needed for the game to load either area, which means everything feels smooth and responsive, perfectly matching the pace of the action on screen. With everything moving so quickly during many of the encounters and rapid switches between past and present required so often, any delay would have been incredibly jarring, something which Respawn manages to avoid entirely. The enemies from the time zone you're in also leave a blue mist when you shift away from them and remain where they were standing when you use the time travel mechanic again, allowing you to much better track where they'll be. And I've got to be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of this at first. I was of the view that it made things too easy, it wasn't realistic, and it took away some of the sense of accomplishment for successfully managing to fight off any immediate threats while also being aware of what was happening in the background. Having played Effect and Cause a good number of times now, I do still think those criticisms apply to an extent, but I think the gameplay style the blue mist is designed to encourage means the pros do ultimately outweigh the cons. Because the mist disappears relatively quickly, it does so much to encourage you to constantly shift between time zones, effectively rewarding you for using the mechanic to its fullest and helping push you away from killing all the enemies in the present before doing the same in the past or vice versa. And it does still reward situational awareness as well. There will be times when you forget to shift while the mist is still present, and at that point you'll fare much better if you were paying attention to enemy placement and weren't simply relying on the mist to help guide you. Combined with Titanfall 2's fast-paced combat and possibly the best movement mechanics in any first-person shooter, battles quickly become incredible spectacles as you shift between fighting humans who are slower but can attack from long range in the past, to fast-moving but melee-based prowlers in the present. Every single second of almost every single fight in Effect and Cause from here on out is a constant balancing act, a perpetual risk-reward scenario during which you not only have to manage two separate encounters, but also decide when it's the right time to shift from one to the other. It can be tricky to adjust to at first, but once you acclimatise to it, it feels amazing to play, as you shift to the past to take down a couple of guards, head to the present to stave off the prowlers, before finally moving back to the past to kill a few more guards once they've lost track of your position. It works fantastically well, and it's testament to how brilliant a job Respawn did that I think they could have built an entire game around this mechanic alone. In my view, this battle also marks the end of what I'd call the second phase of Effect and Cause. The first got you acclimatised to the idea of two separate time zones existing but without you having any control over when the shifts occurred. The second let you move between present and past at will but continued to subtly teach you. And from this point onwards you enter the third and final part of the mission, the experimentation phase. Equipped with all the knowledge you'll need in terms of how the time travel mechanic can be used. From here on out, it's more about taking on scenarios you've already encountered, but which now feature a twist or an increase in difficulty. This next section, for example, requires you to drop into an area in the past, which is on fire in the present, before switching back to the past prior to landing, building on the idea of avoiding hazards from one timeline earlier on, and even helping you prepare for the more sustained and frankly awesome vent drop a little later on. This scenario looks awfully similar to the turret hallway featured earlier, except it requires quicker thinking and much faster use of the time travel mechanic. And in this area, perhaps my favourite in the mission, you're required to constantly shift time zones to jump across it, while also dealing with the threat of enemies in the distance, as opposed to only shifting once to reach your destination. And the pace is then ramped up with the threat of enemies removed and the speed at which you're required to shift becoming even quicker as you do it multiple times while running along walls. With a nifty design choice thrown in here in that the last wall you run across is in the past, the same time zone you need to be in to access the control panel on the other side, which helps save a little time. Oh, and as you reach this area, you might also notice that the further you progress, the harsher the punishment is for failure, with less floors or other objects on offer to save you should you fail. It's not groundbreaking game design by any means, but it's great to see a design philosophy so often used to ramp up the difficulty in platformers also make an appearance in Titanfall 2. It'll also no doubt come to your attention that just as the gameplay begins to ramp up in this final third, so too does the story, with the cause of Major Anderson's fate seemingly revealed to be the wrist-mounted device malfunctioning. Anderson's inclusion in Effect and Cause is a wise choice, as much like BT helps explain what's going on, so too does Anderson, mirroring your journey through the facility while providing exposition beyond what many would pick up through simply progressing through each area. In the meantime, the IMC prepare to launch what they call their fold weapon, powered by a device of non-human origin known as the Ark, a test which has been rushed to completion due to Cooper's presence in the facility. As an aside, I really like the visual representation of how the fold weapon works shown here. I'm someone who can sometimes struggle to visualise how devices like these in games work when they're simply spoken about, so it's really nice that they've catered to less imaginative people such as myself as well. The last section of Effect and Cause brings BT back into the fray, and you'll soon come to the wonderful realisation that you can use the time travel mechanic to bring him to the past as well. This is the most frantic encounter in the entire mission, and adding BT to the mix is a brilliant final flourish. Coming into this encounter, I assumed he would be forced to remain in the present, and it adds one last layer to what is an already staggeringly varied 45 minutes or so. It also explains exactly why there were so many corpses, destroyed robots and bits of Titan littering the area towards the start of this mission, because of you. There's little time to sit and think about that, however, as the Ark begins to overload. As you draw close, everything freezes, and the reason Respawn chose the name Effect and Cause becomes clear. Your presence pushed the IMC to fire the fold weapon earlier than they'd have liked, and something has clearly gone wrong. BT and everyone else in the surrounding area are frozen in place, with Cooper's wrist-mounted device, which is now broken, seemingly preventing similar from happening to him. You caused the weapon to be fired early, which led to this malfunction, which caused time fluctuations, which then enabled you to travel back in time in order to cause the malfunction. Or to put it in simpler terms, you used the effect of the malfunction to become the cause of it. Two more things to note here. First, this is an absolutely gorgeous scene visually and is probably the most enduring image I have when I think of Titanfall 2. And second, there's even an opportunity to alter events slightly here as well. Since you have to move towards the Ark in the past, and that's where the most heated battle takes place, I'd imagine BT will have also been in that time zone for most when the freeze occurs, hence him appearing in that scene. But if for some reason you leave him in the present, he doesn't make an appearance. Another lovely touch to conclude a level packed to the brim with lovely touches. And after one more quick platforming section to reach the Ark and scan it, the mission concludes with Cooper casting off the wrist-mounted device forever. The beacon begins with Cooper and his Titan BT-7274 heading towards an interstellar beacon with the goal of sending a distress signal to Militia Command. During the previous mission Effect and Cause, Cooper and BT discovered that their sworn enemies, the Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation, or IMC for short, had been building a mysterious superweapon known as the Fold Weapon, which they planned to use to destroy the militia homeworld of Harmony. The stakes heading into this mission then are incredibly high. If Cooper and BT succeed, then the militia might just have a chance of averting catastrophe, but fail, and as BT says, 40 million lives could well be lost.
And if we don't get over there in time?
40 million souls on the planet Harmony will be lost. We must get this information to SRS Commander Sarah Briggs.
On the whole, I'd say the beacon's opening few minutes are perhaps its least exciting, although I do like the area filled with toxic smog. Forcing you to use BT to progress serves to remind you that Cooper and BT are ultimately a team, and that you'll need BT's help if you're to succeed. This is something some may have forgotten following Effect and Cause, during which Cooper spent a fair bit of time alone, and he'll soon be separated from BT for a time again in the substation. So, I think using the level design here to help remind you early on that the pair are stronger together is a wise decision. It's also worth noting that I think the beacon is the mission which really begins to show how much Cooper and BT's partnership has developed over the course of the game so far, in both personal and professional terms. This is just the first example of many, and I'll point more of them out as we go along. After a fairly run-of-the-mill encounter clearing stalkers to rescue a militia squad, Cooper and BT are given their next objective.
The power is shut down. We've lost all control of the beacon. We need something like this to jumpstart the system, but this one's destroyed.
And arriving at the substation, things begin to get rather more exciting. In my video covering Effect and Cause, which you can watch by clicking the card on screen now, I spoke a lot about what a great job Respawn did of slowly introducing players to the time travel mechanic. It was introduced in-world and in a way which made sense, with the mission ramping up its complexity over time at a near perfect pace. The beacon doesn't feature time travel, but it does again demonstrate Respawn's mastery of introducing you to new mechanics in ways which make sense in-world. First up, you're tasked with tackling a wall running sequence to cross a gap, but with the added danger of electrocutions should you time your jumps between the walls incorrectly. Respawn then makes you do it a second time immediately after, just to make sure you've got the hang of it, before then throwing you into a fairly run-of-the-mill firefight. Having already made sure you were able to dodge hazards by jumping from wall to wall, the difficulty then increases. This time, you not only have to think about the horizontal, but also the vertical. Your jumps still need to be timed well enough to move you from wall to wall, but to avoid the hazards, you now need to think about how high you jump as well. And much like the first challenge, Respawn again checks you know what you're doing by making you do it twice in quick succession before allowing you to move on. After turning off a turbine and heading down a hole, you'll soon get your hands on the arc tool. Watching this robot use the tool just moments prior should be enough of a hint as to how it functions, and objects the tool can be used on also come with a clear visual indicator to make the mechanic as easy to understand as possible. You can use the tool to interact with objects with green lights, at which point the lights will turn red and they then can't be used again until they turn back to green. Green for go, red for stop. Easy peasy. Much like the two previous examples involving jumping I mentioned earlier, you're then tasked with using the arc tool several times in quick succession to help you quickly get used to the new mechanic. First you have to turn off a turbine with the tool to progress, then use it to open a door, and finally to zap another turbine to turn it back on. I've no idea whether Respawn actually had this in mind, but it feels to me like there are two distinct sections to this area once you've picked up the arc tool, both of which are designed to get you thinking about how it can be used, before you later get the chance to have some fun with it in far more open areas. Its first few uses demonstrate how it can be used to help you navigate the environment, for example by opening a door or switching on a turbine. This is important as you'll later be able to use the tool to open up new paths to get the drop on your enemies, and these first few uses help associate the arc tool with navigating environments. The second section focuses on using the tool to raise heat sinks, which you can then move behind to shield yourself from turbines and safely move forwards. This one's a bit more abstract as there aren't turbines to contend with when the beacon opens up later on, but I do wonder whether this section is designed to get you thinking about the arc tool's applications in terms of combat. The heat sinks are essentially cover, the turbine takes the place of enemies firing at you, and these parts as a whole show you that the tool can not only be used for movement, but to give you a tactical advantage over your enemies as well. At the end of it all, there's a really fast wall running segment which I don't think serves a greater purpose, but is awesome nonetheless, followed by one final challenge which brings together everything you've experienced so far. You have to be able to jump from wall to wall while controlling the height of your jumps, putting the skills you honed at the start of the area into practice, and you also have to use the arc tool again to help clear a path, but at a far quicker pace than had previously been required. And that is the end of what I'd call the beacon's tutorial area. First you practiced your wall running, then you learned how to use the arc tool, and finally you put them both together. I know it may not seem like anything too exciting, but I'll say again here that the way Respawn uses its levels to teach you new mechanics is fantastic. Many games would transport you to a separate training area or bombard you with tutorial messages, or maybe even both, but Respawn instead gradually ramps up the challenge over time within the mission, which makes the Titanfall 2 learning experience a far more satisfying one. It mostly trusts you to figure things out for yourself, it treats you like an adult, and the game is ultimately far better for it. After powering up the beacon, it quickly becomes clear that there's more work to be done, with the beacon's targeting module offline. It's the classic princess is in another castle trope, which I have to be honest and say I'm not a huge fan of, but it does later give you a reason to climb to the top of the beacon, which is rather fun, so all's well that ends well I suppose. The beacon slows its pace here for a few minutes ahead of the next major section, during which you get another moment that demonstrates how BT and Cooper's relationship is continuing to blossom.
My scans detect a functioning uplink targeting module, 428 meters northeast. My analysis indicates a throw is our only option here. I can throw you across the gap.
Are you sure about this?
There is a 68% chance of success.
What about the other 32%?
There is a 32% chance of an incomplete traversal, resulting in catastrophic trauma, massive internal bleeding, and multiple compound fractures. Dismemberment may also occur. There is also the possibility of electrocution and disintegration within the toxic fog below.
I'm a big fan of this exchange. It's well written, it's genuinely funny, and it's also a direct callback to a conversation the two had during Effect and Cause.
Nice. Maybe next time you can throw me.
Noted.
Throughout much of Titanfall 2 up until this point, it's BT giving Cooper advice on how to progress, but here we instead see BT putting one of Cooper's suggestions into action. It's a lovely reversal of the dynamic between the two, which helps clearly indicate that BT is beginning to really believe in Cooper as a pilot. After using cranes to move platforms into positions where you can then use them to wall run to the next section, you arrive at what I consider to be one of the best battles in the entirety of Titanfall 2. Here, the game's fast-paced gunplay, level design which encourages quick movement, and the arc tool all come together to create an absolutely fantastic encounter. The sheer breadth of options you're given during this fight is impressive, to put it lightly. Respawn were the ones who created the template for how a Call of Duty style arena should be structured in a shooter, back when they were known as Infinity Ward and helmed the Call of Duty series, so it's no surprise to here see them take that established formula and continue to build on it. Let's take a quick look at the options available to you during this encounter. The fight begins in a more narrow area where you can take the direct route on foot or use the arc tool to open up a separate path, both of which lead to an area housing a pair of stalkers, which the arc tool can also be used on to get them to fight alongside you. Progressing to the larger arena, the arc tool can then be used to open a lower route in addition to the higher path already available, both of which lead to an elevator the arc tool can raise or lower, with the higher path then leading to a vantage point and the enormous Thunderbolt weapon. Continuing forwards, the arc tool can be used in the central area to bring stalkers into the fight, and it can also help open avenues of attack on the right and in the middle. If you don't fancy either of those, then you can instead use the route on the left side to attack from a different angle, or even use your movement skills to do a bit of climbing and bound across the building's rooftops. I don't think anyone would try to argue that it's the most complex FPS encounter ever created, but what it does give you over other similar titles is choices. Choices enabled through Respawn's philosophy of designing Titanfall 2's levels around the game's movement mechanics and any other options available at the time, such as the arc tool in the beacon, or indeed time travel in Effect and Cause. After making use of a few more cranes and fighting through several more waves of enemies, you arrive at the dish which houses a replacement targeting module. Once the dish has been moved to make it easier to access, you're assaulted by another wave of enemies, and for me this encounter is a little disappointing. The other major battle I've just talked about presented you with so many options for how to tackle things, but this firefight feels limited in comparison, with very few uses for the arc tool on offer. What I loved about Effect and Cause's time travel mechanic was that it was used the perfect amount and Respawn never risked it losing its impact by using it too much. The arc tool will be used a few more times during the beacon, but I've got to be honest, in terms of combat, I actually don't think it's used enough. The encounter I ran through earlier is so good, I really think Respawn should have included a couple more similar battles before this area reached its end. But end it does, with Cooper taking the targeting module and beginning to work his way back to BT. A thoroughly entertaining final test of your platforming and arc tool skills awaits, and I'd say again that this section could have been a little longer given how entertaining it is. That being said, keeping these segments on the short side does help keep the beacon's pace high throughout, and given it's already one of the campaign's longer levels, that may have perhaps been a good thing in terms of keeping you engaged. Reuniting with BT, you take out another group of enemies before Titanfall 2 again continues to hammer home just how much Cooper and BT trust each other.
How are you, BT?
Damage report. Critical systems are functioning properly. And despite your self-evaluation, I'm certain Captain Lastimosa would have said you fought well, Cooper.
Thanks.
Followed by another throw and a brief climb to the dish where Cooper inserts the new module. Cooper then falls from the dish and is saved in the nick of time by BT, and I love the animation of BT struggling but eventually succeeding to reciprocate Cooper's thumbs up. After taking on some Reapers followed by a few Titans, it's time to face the beacon's boss, Richter, and I don't love it, or to be honest, any of the other boss battles with the Apex Predators scattered throughout Titanfall 2's campaign. I understand why Respawn included them. They act almost as training battles, giving you a chance to face off against the different classes of Titan to prepare you for hopping online and dueling with other players. Unfortunately, however, they're usually fairly easy and not particularly engaging. In other games, bosses are often used to add a crescendo to the end of a level, to add that final layer of excitement, but Titanfall 2's campaign is so fast-paced and so consistently engaging throughout that I honestly don't think anything would be lost if the boss battles were removed entirely. Other games use bosses to get your pulse racing just that little bit quicker, but in Titanfall 2, it's already racing to begin with. With Richter blown to smithereens, the beacon online and the distress signal sent, you reach the end of the beacon. There's a final scene here between Cooper, BT and Commander Briggs.
Wait a minute. Lastimosa linked you to a rifleman?
Yes. He had no other options.
Understood. We'll get you transferred to a fully qualified pilot.
Objection. Cooper is my pilot. Our combat effectiveness rating now exceeds 90%. Request permission to retain this link.
You're lucky our backs are up against the wall, BT. Permission granted. That's high praise coming from a machine, Cooper.
Given the numerous examples of Cooper and BT working together brilliantly during the beacon, BT requesting to stay linked to Cooper won't have come as too much of a surprise to anyone, but having him state his desire to continue working alongside Cooper puts a nice full stop on everything which came before, not just in this mission, but during the campaign as a whole. Everything up to this point was about Cooper and BT building their relationship, and now that trust has been established, they're really ready to show what they can accomplish together. Trial by Fire begins with a salute from a Marvin unit and a short speech by Commander Sarah Briggs. What I really like about this opening is that its framing is very similar to another scene at the very start of Titanfall 2's campaign. In this scene from the game's opening, Cooper is still being mentored by Lastimosa and has yet to even finish his training, whereas by the time Trial by Fire rolls around, he's an amazing pilot in his own right. Using the similarity between the two to remind you how far Cooper has come, I think is a really nice way of opening the mission. Arriving on the beach leading to the airbase, I'd hazard a guess and say I'm probably not the only person who was reminded of Medal of Honor Allied Assault's famous D-Day landing scene. Medal of Honor was for me the series that truly kickstarted the set-piece driven, war-focused subgenre of first-person shooters, but it was the Call of Duty franchise which really took their popularity to a completely different level. And given that Titanfall 2 developer Respawn, known as Infinity Ward at the time, was in charge of the Call of Duty series during its incredible rise in popularity, to me it does feel fitting in a way that they seemingly took inspiration from one of the subgenre's most memorable moments. Except in keeping with the rest of the game's campaign compared to, say, a Medal of Honor title, everything is turned up to 11 as you find yourself storming the beach not alongside allied soldiers, but with a unit of Titans instead. And honestly, it's a set piece that works just as brilliantly today as it did some 20 years ago. Leaving the beach, you fight your way through another group of Titans and a few foot soldiers who are little more than a minor inconvenience, before eventually reaching the North Star Titan loadout. Something Titanfall 2 does so well during its campaign is introduce you to these new loadouts at a steady pace, and it's no different during Trial by Fire. The mission also plays into the loadout's strengths from this point forwards, and you'll no doubt notice that a lot of the areas firefights take place in during the second half of the mission offer more than a few opportunities to snipe enemies from a distance using the railgun. And of course, there's also no shortage of enemy Titans on the map, making this the perfect mission during which to try out the North Star's tether trap a few times as well. It might not seem like anything particularly exciting, but getting you used to the advantages and indeed disadvantages of each loadout is a core part of Titanfall 2's campaign. By the time you reach the end of the game's single-player portion, you should have experience both utilising and fighting against all the different loadouts you can equip your Titan with in multiplayer, and North Star in Trial by Fire is, I think, one of the best examples of Titanfall 2's single-player level design working in tandem with that idea. Something I've always loved about Titanfall 2 is the radio messages you receive from enemy pilots, and you'll most likely hear a fair few of them during Trial by Fire. I think they work especially well during this mission, where it's easy to forget that even if most of the combat is Titan on Titan, there are still humans inside them as well. If I'm being perfectly honest, there isn't the same amount of weird and wonderful little design choices in Trial by Fire when compared to, say, Effect and Cause or the Beacon before it, but that's not to say it doesn't stand up on its own merits as well. What it's most important to think about during Trial by Fire is the mission's context, because in my mind, Titanfall 2 is split into three very distinct segments. The first features the missions The Pilot's Gauntlet, BT-7274, and Blood and Rust. On the whole, this trio of missions is perhaps the least exciting of the three different parts of the campaign, but they do still serve a very specific purpose. The Pilot's Gauntlet serves to set up the story and also gets you used to the very basics of gunplay and the game's movement mechanics. BT-7274 then takes things a step further, putting you through your paces during a mission which largely takes place on foot, before giving you the chance to get to grips with controlling a Titan for the first time at its very end. And finally, Blood and Rust has the sole aim of getting you used to playing through missions which include a mixture of both pilot and Titan combat. To put it simply, the three are there to get you used to the basics. The second segment is where Respawn really begins to have fun with the way Titanfall 2 is designed, once they're sure you've mastered the easy stuff first. Into the Abyss focuses predominantly on pilot gameplay, but also asks you to think a lot more about how you traverse the game's environments. Effect and Cause throws in a frankly extraordinary gameplay mechanic all of its very own, and again asks you to fundamentally change the way you play Titanfall 2. And the Beacon features a relatively even mix of pilot and Titan gameplay, but also focuses on Cooper and BT's relationship, solidifying their friendship in players' minds ahead of the campaign's final third. This set of missions essentially encourages you to think outside the box in the way you use Titanfall 2's mechanics to interact with the world around you. Trial by Fire then marks the start of what I'd call Titanfall 2's crescendo, and it does its job perfectly. At this point in the game, Respawn quite correctly assumes that you've most likely mastered playing as both a pilot and a Titan, and decides to focus less on teaching you new tricks and more on pure gameplay. And what better way to get things going than with what I'd describe as the most relentless mission in the entire campaign. Trial by Fire may not be a particularly nuanced mission, but it does an excellent job of getting your blood pumping as you enter the game's final third, and it's also important in two different contexts. First, to me the Beacon was the mission which clearly demonstrated once and for all that BT trusted Cooper just as much as Cooper trusted BT.
Wait a minute. Lastimosa linked you to a rifleman?
Yes, he had no other options.
Understood. We'll get you transferred to a fully qualified pilot.
Objection. Cooper is my pilot. Our combat effectiveness rating now exceeds 90%. Request permission to retain this link.
Which then means it makes perfect sense to make Titan-based combat the centre of Trial by Fire. Over the course of the game, and especially in the Beacon prior, Cooper and BT's relationship had continued to go from strength to strength, and your success during Trial by Fire is used to clearly demonstrate just how powerful the two have become now that they are working perfectly in sync. Second, Trial by Fire also marks the point in the wider story during which the militia begins to take the initiative, and the mission absolutely plays into that idea as well. Everything up until this point in the game had to an extent been about the militia being on the back foot. Your mentor, Captain Lastimosa, is killed early on, you find out about Major Anderson's grisly fate, and discover the IMC's fold weapon midway through the game, and then have to battle your way through scores of IMC troops just to send information to the militia fleet. But here, the roles are reversed. As Titanfall 2 nears its conclusion, the militia are no longer on the back foot, and are instead taking the fight to the IMC, and so in my view, this was the perfect time to include an all-out brawl between two huge groups of Titans, the only one of its kind in the game. If the game's opening and midway missions weren't quite exhilarating enough for you, then I've no doubt Trial by Fire probably did the trick. On the subject of spectacle, it's also worth noting that this is perhaps the least story-heavy mission in the entirety of Titanfall 2. I'd imagine this is a deliberate choice on the part of Respawn, designed to ensure the pace of the level never really slows down. Most other missions during the campaign will have multiple points where you stop to talk to BT or pause for some other story-related moment, but in Trial by Fire there are only very short opening and closing sequences, a few radio messages, and one extremely speedy pause during an elevator ride. And again, this really goes a long way towards maintaining the feeling the mission evokes of it being one relentless all-out brawl. Moving back to the mission itself, and despite their best efforts, the militia's plan doesn't work out, with the IMC managing to load the Ark onto their ship, the IMS Draconis, in the nick of time. I love the fact that Titanfall 2 actually lets you run after the Draconis following the scene of the Ark being loaded onto the ship. Most games would end this mission with the cutscene and not hand back control to players, but here you're allowed to chase after the ship in vain, which does a great job of helping take you down off your pedestal after what has otherwise been a rather brutal but fairly triumphant mission. Sure, you may have triumphed over scores of enemy Titans, but as you chase after the Draconis, it all feels a little bit futile. The Ark kicks things off in style with a few radio messages shared between the militia, while one of my favourite tracks in the game plays in the background.
This is Commander Briggs. We have to recover the Ark. The IMC are taking it to the fold weapon on board the Draconis. All ships, flank speed. We have to hit them hard and fast. Briggs out.
And it also continues the escalation in terms of how its missions begin. At the start of the game, you sit opposite Lastimosa and haven't yet even become a pilot, sitting lower to the ground than the others around you. In Trial by Fire, you're truly ready to play with the big boys and sit eye to eye with the other pilots, thanks to commenter Diamond Rhino 64 for pointing that out. And finally in the Ark, well, the person briefing you is on another ship entirely. It's a great example of how Titanfall 2 continues to escalate events throughout its campaign, putting the somewhat familiar in front of players, but each time in very different circumstances. Your first task during the Ark is to use the anti-Titan rocket launcher known as the Archer to take down a few enemy ships. Much like developer Respawn Entertainment introduces different Titan loadouts throughout the campaign to get you used to using them before you jump into multiplayer, the same is true here of the Archer. It's a very useful weapon to know how to use online, and so you're given the opportunity to lock onto and take down a few enemies, so that you hopefully feel more comfortable using it against human opponents in the future. If there was any doubt in your mind about whether Titanfall 2 could keep up its relentless pace all the way through to the end of its campaign, then I'd guess this next scene probably did the trick. It is an absolutely staggering display of Respawn's mastery of the more cinematic side of this subgenre of first-person shooters. You get an early glimpse at just how threatening the apex predator Viper is, made all the more apparent by the fact he takes down a number of ships with ease in quick succession, right after you've most likely managed to take down maybe one or two in much less exciting fashion, and the framing of this part of the mission only becomes even more impressive when you land on top of another ship as the battle rages ahead of you. Much like the escalation at the start of the mission, BT throwing Cooper here is a continued escalation of previous events. You had Cooper suggesting that BT throw him in effect and cause.
Nice. Maybe next time you can throw me.
Noted.
BT actually throwing Cooper in the beacon, with a bit of discussion beforehand.
My scans detect a functioning uplink targeting module, 428 meters northeast. My analysis indicates a throw is our only option here. I can throw you across the gap.
Are you sure about this?
There is a 68% chance of success.
And now in the Ark, the pair simply get on with it, without giving even a second thought to what they're doing. The next firefight inside the IMS Malta is a fairly run-of-the-mill battle, although the rest of the squad helping you out over the radio is a nice touch, which helps keep you connected to the battle outside even when your attention is focused elsewhere.
Got a guy underneath the stairs. They're around the corner. Watch your left side.
Much like Trial by Fire threw you into a mission focused on Titan combat, which never really slowed down, the Ark can be considered to be the on-foot equivalent. The MCS Carter Braxton explodes ahead of you, and you're thrown into another firefight almost immediately after. Neither mission is particularly subtle, but in a campaign that only lasts 5 to 6 hours, I think that's definitely a good thing. Other shooters with longer campaigns have a bit more time to develop an ebb and flow to their proceedings, slowing things down and speeding things up to create crescendos throughout their campaigns, but Titanfall 2 in my mind is so memorable because it doesn't do that. Respawn never takes their foot off the throttle, and it makes for an experience quite unlike any other. Next, you're joined by a number of squad mates for what is one of the coolest movement sequences in the game. In other levels you can often activate a ghost, which shows you where you need to go, which I've never been a huge fan of, but here you mimic what you've just seen instead, which is by far the more elegant solution, and one I would have liked to have seen used more during the rest of the campaign. The scene during which you join the rest of your squad to face down an IMC squad on the other side of a window is brilliant. It doesn't do anything particularly clever, but it's a great example of Respawn still being able to come up with new and interesting set pieces, even when it may feel like the Call of Duty series has done just about anything and everything you could possibly think of. I spoke of pacing earlier, and here the Ark does slow down for a minute or two as you take control of the steering wheel, so to speak, and attempt to dock with the Draconis. I've never been convinced that this scene is entirely necessary, and would have preferred the pace to have been kept high, but it only lasts a short amount of time, so it's no biggie, I guess. The Ark is a very short mission, clocking in at a little more than 10 to 15 minutes, so I'd imagine this may have been an attempt by Respawn to squeeze a little extra length out of the level where they could. It's here we arrive at the Ark's boss encounter, and as I mentioned during the intro, I think this is by far the best of any featured in Titanfall 2's campaign. It plays out in a similar fashion to many of the game's earlier boss battles in that you fight one of the apex predators with a few additional enemy titans on hand to keep you occupied, but it works so much better in my view due to Viper remaining airborne at the back of the arena while you deal with the other enemies directly ahead of you. In other boss encounters, it felt like the extra enemy titans were there to simply add filler, whereas them combining with Viper in the Ark to offer both a long-range and short-range threat makes for a much more interesting experience. As an aside, I was not very complimentary of Titanfall 2's boss fights during my recent video covering the Beacon, and I also received a lot of comments telling me that Master difficulty made them a much more engaging affair, so I gave the Ark a go on Master, eventually managed to reach Viper, and you know what? They were right. Now, despite the footage you've seen during this video perhaps suggesting otherwise, I am fairly used to playing games at their highest difficulties. Indeed, with certain titles like The Last of Us and its grounded mode, it feels like the difficulty that best fits certain games. And I had already finished Titanfall 2 on Master around the time it released as well. But even with all that experience, Viper was very, very tough. In the end, I managed to beat him using Scorch to take down the other Titans before switching to Tone, but it took a long time and it wasn't very pretty. My point being, the boss battles are definitely improved at higher difficulty levels. It doesn't make their actual setups any more exciting. Viper is still by far the best in that regard, but if you're a glutton for punishment, they're definitely worth trying if you fancy it. After taking down Viper, he soon returns for one final set piece, and again this adds an extra bit of variety to the encounter which I wish was present during the other boss fights. And once he's been dispatched, you make your way towards the Ark with BT very visibly damaged from the encounter. At this point in the game, and after all you've been through with him, it's very easy to forget that BT is still just a machine, which is testament to how well Respawn manages to develop the relationship between Cooper and BT in the short time they had. You remove the Ark from its housing, and this final scene plays out, a surprisingly touching callback to the first time you met BT.
Get the Ark out of here!
Negative. We are trapped.
What are you doing?
Protocol 3. I will not lose another pilot. Brace for impact.
And as the screen fades to black, you're left with a bit of a cliffhanger. The mission opens with Kuban Blisk, the leader of the Predators, and his second-in-command Sloan trying to reclaim the Ark from BT.
Oi, Titan! You're gonna open up and give me what I want.
Voice command. Not recognized.
And with BT refusing to give it to them, the pair are quickly forced to up the stakes.
I don't care how broken you are. I know deep down, some things still work in there. Now open up. I'm going to shoot your pilot in the head. You still remember numbers, don't you? I'm going to count to 3.
The encrypted message appearing on the top left of the screen is a nice touch and something that maybe could have been used more during the rest of Titanfall 2's campaign, but there's little time to dwell on it as BT causes a bit of a commotion. Most of the game's final third focuses squarely on you taking the initiative, but for a few brief moments during this scene you feel somewhat powerless. That is until you try to leave the area without BT, at which point he calls you back and hands you something called a Sear Kit. The Sear Kit contains 3 things: a data knife, a smart pistol, and BT's data core, and if you thought Titanfall 2's final mission was going to continue at a slow pace, you'd be proven wrong just moments later. The smart pistol is a very smart pistol indeed. While the time travel mechanic in Effect and Cause may be the more headline-grabbing twist in the game's campaign, the next few moments spent with this incredible weapon aren't very far behind at all. There's actually very little to using it. Simply aim in the general direction of your enemies and fire, and the gun will do the rest. But it's another fantastic example of how expertly every single one-off mechanic in Titanfall 2 works alongside its core gameplay loop. In terms of how the areas you traverse over the next 2 to 3 minutes are designed, there's little different from any others you've made your way through previously, but when combining it with the smart pistol, it suddenly becomes one of the most memorable in the entire game. What I love about this section is that it makes even those with fairly limited skills, like me, feel like unstoppable killing machines, and to be honest, that is why it's so clever. Anyone can go on YouTube and watch videos of people with immense talent being brilliant at whatever video game they're playing, but I can't think of any other game which actually allows you to experience that for yourself, no matter how good at the game you actually are. Whether you're someone who can land a headshot from the other side of a map, or struggles to hit an enemy from 2 feet away doesn't really matter. Every single person who plays the game gets to have at least one moment during which they feel like they can't be beaten before everything draws to a close. However, as mentioned during the introduction, all good things must come to an end, and eventually Cooper is reunited with BT after placing his data core into an empty Vanguard chassis. I remember watching this scene play out for the first time and almost immediately forgetting about the smart pistol, and I think that's testament to how well Respawn Entertainment develops the pair's relationship over the course of the game. There's no doubt you shared plenty of amazing moments with Cooper and BT throughout Titanfall 2, but it's at this point that it really begins to feel like being reunited with an old friend. Up next is a series of encounters not too dissimilar from those during the rest of the campaign. Putting you in the shoes of a Vanguard Titan is certainly a wise choice, as after the Smart Pistol section there was always the danger of you not feeling quite as powerful as you did before, but thankfully this rather hefty new loadout helps ensure that isn't the case. The scenery during these battles lends proceedings an epic feel as well. You have this gorgeous skybox, the fold weapons spinning in the background, and an even more expansive view of what's happening almost immediately after, and the constant radio messages and announcements over the tannoy give events a real feeling of urgency.
Attention IMC personnel. This is General Marder. The mercenaries have delivered the Ark. Prep the fold weapon.
A final boss battle then follows against Sloan, and much like the other boss battles in Titanfall 2, barring perhaps Viper, I can't help but feel like it is a bit of a letdown. The twist this time is that Sloan will occasionally disappear for a moment or two, while what seems like a greatest hits selection of the game's enemies jumps into the fray. First you take on several IMC Titans, then a group of Reapers, and finally a gaggle of Ticks. And while it does help keep things at least moderately interesting, I can't help but feel like something as awe-inspiring as the fight with Viper was needed here to really end things on a high note. Despite Cooper and BT's best efforts, they're seemingly unable to stop the fold weapon from firing, at which point Blisk makes another appearance. I really like this scene. I've never been the biggest fan of the Apex Predators as antagonists, but Blisk attempting to recruit you before brushing the IMC's General Marder off and leaving left me feeling a little more intrigued about them than I had moments prior. And then, for the last time ever, you hear two of Titanfall's most famous phrases.
Protocol 3. Protect the pilot.
BT, what are you doing?
Trust me.
And there's not much more I can really add here, other than to say that this scene gets me every time. Well, actually, there is one more thing. If you choose not to respond to BT before he sacrifices himself, you do get a different, albeit nowhere near as heartwarming piece of dialogue.
Protocol 3. Protect the pilot. Goodbye, Jack.
The mission then concludes with a final gameplay section which appropriately focuses on the game's terrific movement, the mechanic which underpins everything great about the title gameplay-wise. Before Cooper manages to escape in the nick of time, Typhon explodes, and Commander Sarah Briggs really makes you feel down in the dumps about what happened to BT.
Pilot Cooper. A lot of people owe their lives to you. And to BT.
A feeling which Cooper then adds to with his own monologue as his data knife, smart pistol and helmet come into view.
Commander Briggs says I'll be inducted into the Marauder Corps and assigned a new Titan. After the techs wipe what's left of my neural link with BT. I don't know what that'll feel like, to get assigned a new Titan. I kinda like the old one.
After this scene, the credits kick in, but if you wait, there's one more surprise yet to come. Now, I think it's safe to say that based off this scene, BT is still alive, having managed to transfer some of himself into Cooper's helmet. At the time you may not have realised it, but there is a hint as to how he might have managed to survive during Effect and Cause.
Pilot Cooper, I have transferred some of my AI functions into your helmet in order to permit communication across time shifts.
He also uses the phrase "trust me" before he plummets to his death, and I like to think that BT may have been trying to give Cooper a little hint that he did have a way of them both emerging from the situation unscathed. And finally, the way the helmet flashes isn't random either. It spells J-A-C-K, or Jack with a question mark at the end in binary, another indication that BT may not have in fact kicked the bucket. So I think it's safe to say that if we ever do get a Titanfall 3, it looks very much like Cooper and BT will still be able to feature. And with that, we reach the end of the video. Thank you so much for taking the time to check it out, boys, girls and pilots. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts on Titanfall 2, and fingers crossed, we'll meet again soon.